Guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm Bind, and today I'm coming at you with a little attitude. That's right. So guys, have you ever heard people, I'm sure you have you ever heard people talking using fancy words where it's immediately clear to you that they don't understand what those words mean? Well, isometric is such a word. So as you might know, I talked about this briefly in another video. Teaching students in art school have done this now for more than 20 semesters, right? So I know young people that describe their design work and their sketching, their digital art, and the level of clue they have about it and using words to describe it, right? So in the public space, it's not very common to find discussions about an isometric perspective, right? So therefore, I want today to use another example that illustrates perfectly what I mean by people not knowing what the word actually means. So the media, because let's be frank, a lot of our art and a lot of designers and artists out there, they cater towards media, right? So their art ends up being in movies or games. So video games, they utilize a lot of artwork, which then is later discussed by both enthusiasts and also reviewers. And they have a lot to say about graphics, perspectives, and all of that. So let's have a look.
Especially at first glance, it's easy to think of the Ascent as simply an isometric co-op shooter.
But making an isometric game like this brings with it serious challenges as well.
The camera still used that isometric top-down perspective.
But developer Nap's team's isometric action-adventure RPG...
With others twice the top-down isometric view of strife and war.
Visual choices that stem from the game's isometric camera.
If you've ever wanted to play an isometric version of Red Dead Redemption 2...
Delight is an isometric RPG known as Ember from Enfusion Interactive.
For leading aesthetics and isometric camera perspective.
And the isometric view and all of that.
And an isometric perspective.
And ushers that excellent isometric experience onto console.
Like, I play PoE, I play Diablo 3, I play Lost Ark. I don't hate isometric games, but it is a constraint more than I think it's a benefit.
Right. Yeah, guys, you guessed it. All of these clips, what do they have in common? Nothing described as isometric in these clips actually is isometric. None of these games, these graphics whatsoever can be called isometric by any standard, by any definition of that word. So but yeah, let me explain this in Photoshop. Let's jump into a canvas. So guys, let me demonstrate to you about what actually means isometric, right? So what is isometric in general? Isometric is a projection technique. It is a graphical projection with a metric system to it that will project shapes onto the canvas in a manner so that there is no vanishing of any of the three dimensions. That is the most basic description, right? So usually when you look at a cube, which is the standard form to demonstrate projection techniques, right? It will look like this. You will have your, let's see, you will have one side, and then you will have a second side. This will make sense in a second. And that second side is turned in an angle, right? And the angle it is turned in is 120 degrees. So this will constitute your second dimension. And then basically we do it again. Just so. Could have mirrored this, but this will do. So guys, this is the essence of isometric projection. Now the rest I will freehand the rest, right? So, or not. So you have your axis. You have your axis, and then around that axis you can draw more lines that will then make up, well, it's the problem that if you're not accurate, this doesn't work so well. So that will then constitute your square. And now, why is it called isometric? Very simple. There's a metric system applied to the shapes, and the word iso, which is Greek, simply means is it the same or one metric, right? So what does it mean? It means the whole thing uses one metric for all of those 3 dimensions, because what you essentially have is you still have your x, y, and z axis, right? And then what you also have, in theory, what you're expressing is orthogonal lines with 90-degree angles. But the way it's projected, there's only one way to only use one metric, isometric, right? And that is if all those sides are the same. So only if this is true, which it is, because you saw me copying that line and then basically putting it here. So we know that the length of A, B, and C are equal. And also the next thing is we also need the same angle for every perspective dimension case, right? So the only way you can have equal angles in 3 dimensions, so to speak, is if you divide it perfectly. And if you do that, every angle will be 120 degrees. So this is the case in the isometric projection technique. And which will lead to some, not coincidences, but to some things. So for example, that point and the point behind it coinciding in the same space, right? Also, this might be shocking to you if this is new to you, because all the angles are the same, because all the angles are the same metric, and because all the sides are the same metric, that means that this shape is exactly the same shape as this. You just turn it and then place it, all these shapes, and the shape here in the background, it's also the same. They are all the same because you have one metric only. This is isometric. Anything else is not isometric, okay? So just by knowing that, you know more than most people, okay? So I said it's not vanishing, which is clearly the case, because if you follow any of those lines, any of the 3 dimensions, they will always remain parallel. You can take this box, copy it as many times as you want to, and just put it next to each other, and it's logically going back in space or coming forward in space, but since there is no vanishing of any dimension, it never gets any bigger or any smaller, because there's again only one metric to all the angles and only one metric to all the sides. Okay, now I know what you think. You're thinking, oh, I've seen other stuff that does not have vanishing of the dimensions, right? And you're correct. So, okay, example number 2. What about, oh, let's use black again. What about, let's assume these are the same, right? Right, let's assume these are the same. So you have seen something like this. I am very sure of it. And you might now say, well, these don't vanish. And yeah, none of them vanish. That's correct. And you would say, well, it has to be isometric then, right? No. It is a projection, it is a metric projection technique, but it is not isometric because it does not use only one metric. So what we have here is we have one kind of an angle and then a second kind of an angle that applies to the other 2 dimensions. We have one side and the second side that is the same and a third side that is not the same. So essentially we have 2 angles and 2 sides are the same, but one angle and one side is not the same. Therefore, it is not isometric, it is dimetric. So you guessed what di means. It means 2. You now have 2 metrics. A 2-metric projection system. So, and shocker, there is also trimetric because you have 3 dimensions and you have potentially 3 length of any rectangular shape and 3 angles of any rectangular shape to tinker with, and that is the max of that. So you have isometric, dimetric, and trimetric. Those are the projection techniques that you have, and most media and most games are not isometric. Some are dimetric, some are trimetric, but most are none of those. Most are just plain real 3D with a vanishing point. They just are top down, and that is why people call them isometric. So maybe quick example for the third kind. The third kind would be pretty, let's quickly demonstrate this. So then you would have, instead of having one side the same, this side would be different. And this side will also be different. Now, this is now, I'm estimating this very poorly. And there is one, of course. Now, okay, you can kind of see it there. Of course, this might be too long to sell as a cube, but yeah, this will do. Okay, so now we're at a trimetric shape where all these angles are not the same and all these length of the sides are not the same. So there you go. You have 1, you have 2, and you have 3 metrics applied to a projection technique. None of them have any vanishing points. none of them vanish anywhere. All are metric projection techniques, but they are different in the nature of how many metrics are applied, right? So now that you know that, let's have a look at some images of some graphics. So brought you guys some screenshots here. So this is very old SimCity, and as you can see from how the graphics are set up with the pixel raster, this is the closest you can get with pixel art to isometric. Why do I say the closest? Because in pixel, right, you have another metric, which is 1 pixel, that you have to respect. So what happens is you can only go 1 pixel up and 1 pixel left, and then 1 pixel up and 1 pixel right. So the way that they create these angles is usually by going, because if you would just go right, you would get a 90-degree angle, and if you would go 1 pixel right, 1 pixel up, 1 pixel right, 1 pixel up, this would be a steeper angle. It would be 45-degree angle, because it would be exactly half of 90 degrees, right? And then what you can do is, and what they all do is, you can go 1 pixel to the right, 2 pixels to the right, 1 pixel up, 2 pixels to the right, and that's how they create this angle, which is also not 120 degrees, or in that case 30 degrees. It is actually half of 45 degrees, so 22.5 degrees. So it's not actually real isometric, but that's what the goal is here, and therefore I will let that pass, right? So because then if you talk in detail, like if you're really being very, very strict, there is no isometric pixel graphics, period, right? Because the way I described it before, this would be a dimetric, because that means the top shape slightly flatter than those left and right side shapes. So they're not the same, because there will be 2 metrics applied, right? So yeah, that's how isometric looked back in the days. And yeah, I will just call this isometric for the record, because that was clearly the goal here, and the entire graphics is orientated in that fashion. So that is what dictates the entire graphic grid, right? Now we have this Age of Empires. You can also see that this was the goal here with these shapes, and then all of the orientations of all of the buildings are with the goal of being isometric, right? So therefore, again, if you watched my perspective video, I say one thing that is very crucial to all the perspectives and all of the views, and that is that the object specifies the perspective and not the image itself. There is no image where you say, oh, this image only can contain 1 point perspective, right? Because what if you have objects in the image that you just rotate in different directions? The image is not changing, right? It's just the objects that demand a different perspective, and it's the same here. Inside the world of projection techniques, you can have an isometric projection object, and then imagine you turn this building only 45 degrees, and you will have a different projection then that uses different 2 kinds of metrics, and that therefore would be a dimetric object within that same world. And you will, if you twist it a little bit, you will have a trimetric object in your projection graphics world, right? So we call the graphics isometric because the goal is to have everything rectangular orientated in that manner, right? So another thing that qualifies as isometric. And then you all know this, at least if you're my age, original Diablo 1, right? Another isometric game. You cannot, in this screenshot, it might not be the best, but you can see it's the same technique as in the SimCity one, right? And they use this throughout the game, I think even in the second one. But then what happens is there is contemporary Diablo, and as you can see, as opposed to our friend from Digital Foundry in the video clip, is not isometric in any fashion, right? And also, that is a good point for me to bring in here, is people will often talk about, oh, is the view, the camera is isometric. No. Guys, there's no isometric camera, okay? It doesn't exist, right? That's clear, that's just bullshit, okay? Because the camera doesn't matter, right? If you have your camera in AutoCAD or in a 3D engine program like Rhino or something, what you can do is you can just go to the render perspective and change it to isometric or change it back, and you can still move the camera. It doesn't matter, it's not about that, right? So you can clearly see here that there is vanishing here. It's just a real 3D perspective, that's all it is. View is top down. People confuse it with isometric or just don't know the full meaning of the word. Next example, very good game, original XCOM. Played this in the 90s, I think. Yeah, I don't know if you guys remember that one, but I do. And you can clearly see, actually this is a better example even, how the pixel is 2 pixels and they go up and then they go 2 pixels, and that's the best representation you can get of this. And you can clearly see that you can make a pretty close to isometric rectangular shape with this, right? And again, the whole world, the whole grid of the whole world is orientated that way, therefore it passes as isometric, right? Then what you have also is the new XCOM, not so new anymore, I guess, but you can clearly see this is actually a pretty good screenshot, because you can immediately see that the idea is the same, the orientation of shapes towards the camera, but it is a real 3D perspective. So this shape clearly being much smaller than those in front, and then you see the distortion in the real perspective, you see the vanishing of those shapes, not isometric. It's nothing to do with isometric, it's just a top-down view that is turned 45 degrees towards the structures that are like important for the game world, right? That's why you would turn the camera, you would not have these route shapes. They would become much more of a different orientated rectangular shapes, and would not resemble the isometric view as much, but it is in no way isometric. So guys, today is the day my coffee actually got warm and not cold, because it was so warm that I poured cold coffee from the fridge and now it's slightly too warm. Anyways guys, I hope I cleared this up for you if you were interested in that. What is isometric and what is not isometric? As you saw in the examples, most things described isometric are not actually isometric. So now you can go around, be that guy that is like, if people discuss about that thing and use it in the wrong way, you can say, actually, don't be that guy. Okay, you should stay humble, right? But it is good to know what isometric really means. And guys, I understand that people are not experts at designing or drawing. They don't need to know this in detail. still, I would say you shouldn't describe a real 3D perspective as isometric, even if you're criticizing a game, because it's kind of not professional. Looking at you, the F. But it's not that big of a deal, because for most people, if you're a consumer and if you just consume a review of a game, it doesn't really matter. However, I also don't want to dismiss the use of that knowledge entirely, because if you're a creator like we are, right, you should know this, because you're the one who will create the artwork for those games, and then you should actually know what you're doing and why you're doing it. And even if the guy contracting you or the studio says, let's do something isometric, that is then the time when you're talking to professionals that you should go, wait a minute, this is not isometric. We need to get the terminology right, because in a professional space you should know what people are talking about and what the rules are of whatever graphic system you're doing and you're creating for. So, guys, leave me your comments down below if you learned something today. If not, and this was just entertainment for you, let me know what you think. Let me know if you came across the misuse of this word at all, like I have, or if I'm just that nitpicky guy again. Anyways, guys, see you next time.